Part 4. Autumn does not come to the Skagit Valley in sweet apple chomps. It blasts of blue sky and painted leaves with crisp football afternoons and squirrel chatter and bourbon and lap robes under a harvest moon. The East and Midwest have their autumns, and the Skagit Valley has another. October lies on the Skagit like a wet rag on a salad. Trapped beneath low clouds, the valley is damp and green and full of sad memories. The people of the valley have far less to be unhappy about than many who live elsewhere in America, but still an aboriginal sadness clings like the dew to their region. Their land has a blurry beauty, as if the Creator started to erase it but had second thoughts. It has dignity, fertility, and hints of inner meaning, but nothing can seem to make it laugh. The short summer is finished. It is October again, and Sung Dynasty mists swirl across the fields where seed cabbages, like gangrened jack-o'-lanterns, have been left to rot. The ghost light of old photographs floods the tide flats, the island outcroppings, the salt marshes, the dikes and the sloughs. The frozen food plants have closed for the season. A trombone of geese slides southward between the overcast and the barns. Upriver there is a chill in the weeds. Old trucks and tractors rusting among the stumps seem in autumn especially forlorn. October scenes. At the dog-bitten Swinomish Indian Center near La Conner, there is a 40-foot totem pole, the top figure of which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One of the queerer projects of the WPA, Roosevelt's Harvard grin, is faded and wooden in the reservation mist. Outside of concrete, boys have thrown crab apples through the colored glass windows of an abandoned church. Crows carry the bright fragments away to their nests. On the freeway south of Mount Vernon, watched over by a hovering sausage, surrounded by a ring of prophecy, an audacious roadside zoo rages against the multiplying green damp chill as if it were a spell cast upon the valley by gypsy friends of the sun. Events transpire within that zoo, which must be recorded immediately and correctly if they are to pass into history undeformed. Things rot with a terrible swiftness in the northwest rains. A century from now, the ruins of Captain Kendrick Memorial Hot Dog Wildlife Preserve will offer precious little to reimbursed archaeologists for their time. No Dead Sea Scrolls will ever be found in the Skagit Valley. It's now or never for this Bible. The Second Coming. The Second Coming did not quite come off as advertised. The heavens opened, sure enough, but only to let a fine pearly rain streak through to spray the valley. Instead of celestial choirs, there were trucks snorting on the freeway. Instead of Gabriel's trumpet, there was John Paul Ziller's flute. Jesus himself showed up disguised as a pop art sculpture, caked with plaster from head to toe, and contrary to advanced publicity, he was in no better shape upon his return than he was at his departure. He was, in fact, dead as a boot. But, reader, do not let this fact escape you. It was him, all right. Stretched out in the pantry of the Zillers' roadside zoo was none other than the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Prince of Peace, the Good Shepherd, the Blessed Savior, the Master, the Messiah, the Light of the World, our Lord Jesus Christ, the scandal of history. It has recently come to my attention, said Plucky Purcell, that Charles IV, Charles the Bland, once said that life is a pickle factory. I cannot accept that, as I have found it impossible to determine whether life is sweet or sour. Perhaps, said Amanda, purring as Purcell nibbled her tattoos, you would prefer the words of Ba Ba of Bow Wow who claims that life is a fortune cookie in which someone forgot to put the fortune. And that, reader, pity me, is what I return to. First off, there was Jesus Christ, the most vertical figure in history, lying, quite horizontal, in the pantry of our roadside attraction. That is, his mummified corpse was lying there, but in the case of Jesus, as in the case of no other historical figure, coming upon him dead was even more extraordinary than coming upon him breathing. What an electric heater perched on the rim of the bathtub of the world that dead Jesus was. Secondly, and some readers will find it shocking that I could list this second event in such easy proximity to the first, as if the second were of only slightly less magnitude than the first. Secondly, there was Amanda and Plucky in the midst of a marathon embrace, their love-red ears tuned in only to each slish and slurp, oblivious to the fanfare of slamming doors that had accompanied my return to the zoo, and oblivious too to the blast of silent waves that emanated earth-round from that mummy in the downstairs closet, although Amanda later claimed that she had taken Purcell to bed chiefly to get his mind off the corpse, the presence of which was shoving him toward nuthood. Speaking of madness, I confess it was a close companion to me, too, those first days back at the Roadhouse. Some folks might believe it visits me still, but nobody rushed me off to the sack, I'll have you know. Here the reader has probably noticed that the author has begun to write in the first person singular, and he may have thought, aha, the autobiographical first person singular is always the choice of men in trouble, whereas only those writers who are safely disengaged from their subjects may indulge in third-person motifs, or that most cowardly of all voices, the first-person plural, the pompous and devious editorial we. Actually, I've slipped into first-person singular on several occasions during the drafting of this report, but always I went back and corrected the oversight. You see, it had been my intention to serve up this report as a strip of lean, rare meat, ungarnished by the sauces of my own personality. What has become increasingly apparent, however, is that I am irreversibly enmeshed in the events this document will henceforth describe. So even had I time to restore a third-person treatment to the preceding paragraph, and time is growing precious, it could serve no honorable purpose. It might as well be known, here and now, that it is I, Marx Marvelous, who is your host and narrator at this most anticipated of all encores, the second appearance of You-Know-Who. Your host and narrator, yes indeed, and I excuse you if you are thinking that of all the persons upon this planet to whom might have fallen the chore of witnessing the Advent, or more correctly the prelude to the Advent, for even as I type these words, the returned Christ might be revealing himself to the cameras on some strip of Florida sand, where heretofore only citrus cuties in bikinis may have posed, and can the shock of world recognition be far behind? Why must it have fallen to this admittedly ambivalent boy scientist to whom the true and powerful workings of language remain a puzzle? No more than an amateur plumber can deny the deepening mess on the bathroom floor can I deny the broken pace of this manuscript, its contradictions, its vagueness, its digressions, its its 1,001 shifts in style. As for those stylistic inconsistencies, Amanda told me once that it is the natural state of Cancerians to be easily and tellingly influenced, to let the styles of others rub off on them at will. So if the reader is zodiacally oriented, and I maintain that I am not, perhaps the disclosure that I am Cancer-born will lift me off the hook. Of course, an astrological excuse will never suffice for literary critics or professors of English, but they've no damn business with their snouts in a document like this one anyway. At any rate, I am indeed impressionable, and thus parts of my report turn out written in John Paul Ziller's idiom, parts in Plucky Purcell's idiom, and parts in the idiom of the young mistress of the zoo. Can you pick out these parts, where each holds sway. And there are times when everybody talks alike and that it is like a smart-ass Doctor of Philosophy candidate at Johns Hopkins U. Oh well, I cannot apologize. Granted the literary atrocities, will I be tried and hung at some future Nuremberg for writers? Still I rejoice that it was I, and not some super journalist with 80 million words on his speedometer, who drew the task of describing the apocalypse. It makes me shudder to conceive of another roadside attraction as the day Christ came back. And I am gleeful, too, that it was I who drew the task instead of a biblical scholar or instead of one of our bright young novelists, even for although they, any one of them, might have brought to the historic task skills and insights beyond my command, I greatly fear that they would have been so thunderstruck by the presence of our Lord, dead and plaster-soiled, that they would have neglected the girl, Amanda. Once, a famous European dilettante visited Amanda's town. The dilettante lectured to the Davy Crockett Fine Arts and Hot Lemonade Society. It was a warm evening in early summer. Amanda's father, enormously fat in a white linen suit, took his 13-year-old daughter to the talk. The lecture was given in the high school gym. Father and daughter sat in the front row. Amanda, in a dainty pink organdy dress with a yellow sash, was perhaps the only member of the audience who did not sweat profusely on this cultural pilgrimage. The dilettante must have noticed, for the following day he called upon Amanda's father at his greenhouse and requested permission to paint the young girl's portrait. The father was honored. Amanda posed in a wicker chair, but the dilettante painted her rising from behind a cloud. The picture pleased Amanda. She agreed to go walking the fields with the dilettante to learn more of art and European culture. The lesson, as it turned out, had a familiar ring. Amanda, girlishly thirsty for knowledge, was not certain she was learning anything new at all. All at once, however, she saw, fluttering forward without flaw along its own organic line, a most magnificent Arizona swallowtail. All problems of art are solved, she thought, for she had found the, quote, line of beauty, end quote, in the bumpy line of moth flight. She sprang to her feet and chased after the butterfly while the dilettante stamped and kicked and shouted at the insect a term which Amanda could not understand. Although knowing the dilettante, she was certain it was a phrase of a scholarly nature. In fact, years passed before Amanda learned that the, quote, coitus interruptus, end quote, was not the scientific name for the swallowtail butterfly. In the evenings, after the zoo had closed, Amanda liked to sit beside the slough and listen to the frogs. Listening to the frogs was like turning the pages of an expensive coffee table book on Moorish architecture. Each time she turned the page, she was met by another mosaic of stupefying density. To hear you tell it, said one of her friends, you'd think the frogs invented algebra. Well, said Amanda, turning the loaded pages, a pollywog is more than a monologue. Amanda always brushed her teeth with crushed strawberries. The strawberry pulp whitened her teeth and pinkened her gums. When death finally sucks her down the drain, as it must suck everyone, Amanda will leave an iridescent ring around the tub. There were no mail-order catalogs in 1492. Marco Polo's journal was the wish book of Renaissance Europe. Then Columbus sailed the ocean blue and landed in Sears' basement. Despite all the Indians on the escalator, Columbus's visit came to be known as, quote, discovery, end quote. The, quote, discovery, end quote, of the body of Jesus Christ is also a story of plunder. By all rights, it is Plucky Purcell's story, and I wish that he were here to tell it. There is no way that I can articulate that little episode and make it sound credible the way I can make, say, the discovery of the fourth dimension spin of electrons sound credible. For the mind that directs my typing fingers, nurtured as it was in the safe, sane laboratories of Johns Hopkins University, is not suited to describing quirks in what I have been taught is a rational world. I damn such quirks and wish them the bad luck I wish yogis and astrologers and others who claim to see things in the sky that I and my telescope cannot. In Purcell's mind, on the other hand, reality rushes by like a wild white river, while quirks like crocodiles and iguanas sun themselves in grotesque comfort on the shores. Unfortunately, the pluck penned no letters concerning his discovery, there just wasn't time for that, from which I might quote, and at the moment he's rather occupied while eluding the dragons of CIA and FBI, not to mention playing his role in whatever worthy plan the magician might have conceived for the corpse. So I myself will assume the responsibility of relating how Jesus was found, and, damn it folks, this time I really mean it, I will do it as quickly and simply as possible. Listen. As most of you recall, there was a fairly severe geological disturbance in Italy on September 27th of this year. The volcano Vesuvius erupted, killing livestock in its immediate vicinity and causing widespread damage to crops. A small tidal wave wrecked boats in the Neapolitan area, and 25 or 30 tremors, most of them mild, were felt up and down the Italian boot. The most severe of the earthquakes, although in terms of death and destruction it could hardly be called a catastrophe, was centered in Vatican City. Surely you remember. Windows were smashed, the facades of some buildings were cracked, and in St. Peter's Square a small section of pavement buckled. On the whole, however, damage was light, above ground. But beneath the Vatican proper, the catacombs took a beating. Vast sections of them were harmed. That much you learn from your newspaper and your TV. There was quite a fuss about it on September 28th. Remember, but journalism is as fickle as a young actress, and by the 29th it was a story the large papers carried deep in their rear sections and the small papers carried not at all. Who, after all, can sustain interest in damaged catacombs in times like these? There were a dozen injuries in the Vatican tremor, but no deaths. And the only phase of it that provoked conversation around breakfast tables and water coolers in America was the disclosure that its unruly vibrations had bounced His Holiness out of bed. If the papal posterior was bruised in the bouncing, the Vatican did not share with the public that intimacy, and thus the incident quickly slipped beneath the sea of reportable events that lap each evening at the feet of the 6 o'clock news. The caved-in tunnels, the broken art, and artifacts were subject which only the Vatican paper and some Catholic magazines examined in great detail. The primary effects of the Vatican quake could hardly, to repeat myself, be called a catastrophe. The secondary efforts were something else again. The world has not yet informed of those secondary effects. When the earthquake hit, plucky Purcell, like the Pope, was dreaming. Nearly Normal Jimmy once advanced the theory that it was impossible for the man who awakens in the morning to know with certainty that he is the same man who went to sleep at night. Nearly Normal became rather obsessed with that notion and as a result developed insomnia. Amanda thought the whole thing was silly. Said she, "What difference does it make who you are when you wake up as long as you wake up somebody?" Like the oft-quoted Chinese philosopher, she would have been content to wake up a butterfly. But Nearly Normal Jimmy rested no easier, and finally, on the advice of Ziller, called upon a magi who lived in a pyramid in Illinois and had his psyche tattooed. With a small brand inked into the skin of his mind, he could roam far and wide while sleeping and yet always keep tabs on himself. He had belled the cat of his consciousness, so to speak. However, there was one drawback. From the day he was tattooed, Nearly Normal always had the same dream. The only image that ever came to him in dreaming was the image of his tattoo, a leather armchair of the Tibetan variety. It was an image to which Jimmy was attracted, to be sure, but it made for dull hours a-dreamin'. Purcell never had that problem, whether he lay on a jail bunk, on a motel mattress soaked with sex, or on a monk's stingy cot. He slumbered like an old dog, and his dreams were as rich and varied as the total output of Hollywood from birth of a nation until now. Quote, colossal, unquote, is an adjective that could be applied to Purcell's dreams. I gotta dream spectaculars, he said, or someone else will dream them in my place. The Vatican earthquake shook Purcell loose from one level of spectacle and deposited him on another. The air he awoke in was choked with dust and rent with screams. Of the 12 persons who were heard in the quake, 7 acquired their inquiries not 200 feet from where Plucky lay dreaming. That boy has a knack for being in the thick of things. Panic moved through the catacombs like a compulsive housekeeper, emptying the ashtrays of reason and mopping up the tracks of experience. The catacombs took on an insect quality. Confusion spun in the debris. But while the others who roomed in the catacombs, the several score underground soldiers of the cross, while they tried in panic to make up their minds whether to run for the ground level exit before or after gathering up their possessions, before or after ministering to their wounded comrades, impulsive Plucky Purcell not only chose an immediate course of action, he made a long-term decision concerning his future as well. It was a decision that was to affect the destiny of the race, although Purcell could not have known that then. In the Bokanon it is written, peculiar travel suggestions are dancing lessons from God. 1, 2, 3, and 4, ah. 1, 2, 3, and 4, ah. Fast and funny were the steps Purcell took down the rumbling corridor. Purcell was not so much running as he was dancing, and he was not so much dancing as he was laughing with his feet. 1, 2, 3, and ha-ha! He moved not toward the stars that led to the surface, but toward those which led to the next lower level of catacombs. As he moved, hop, skip, wiggle, through the crumbled stone and fearful echoes, his brain pan sizzled with visions. Visions of autumn in New York, visions of San Francisco's doll-faced hills, visions of the wonders of Mexican agriculture, visions of studio doors flung open in welcome, visions of burning herbs and young pussy, both in such profusion that his heart sickened and flopped like a musical dove in the odors that the visions brought to his nostrils. Visions of big escape, of throwing off the Catholic curse, which far more than a year now had held him in its coils and sent him probing closer and closer to the dark, dangerous heart of the one true church, taunting him with religious riddles until he, once happy-go-lucky hustler, could think of little else but finding some way to cope with an immense and growing world force that twinkled so tenderly of heaven and stunk so terribly of hell. Without consciously intending to, he had hacked into the Roman mysteries as a safari hacks into dense jungle, and he had come down with velvet fevers and had been bedeviled by such opulent deliriums that he no longer knew if the evil he saw was actually there or whether his sickness conjured it. Now, like a schizophrenic suddenly made whole, like a harried lover at last emotionally free of the bitch he thought he could not bear to lose, Purcell had awakened from his long Catholic nightmare, shaken from it by an actual seizure of the earth. And the visions that unfolded in his mind were familiar ones of a secular life he could barely wait to resume. Feet laughing beneath him, he approached the treasure vaults. Gold and silver are heavy cargo, but even though he knew he could stuff no more than a few $1,000s worth into his belongings, it would get him to America and friends and dope and pussy, and however much he plundered it, it was scant payment for the horrors religion had put him through. He danced over a body. No, it was a toppled statue of a Grecian athlete. Its censoring Roman fig leaf had broken away in the fall, and now its marble penis pointed at the stars and freedom. Dance on, Purcell. 1, 2, 3, and ha-ha. Oh, mine. Whew. You waltz divinely, Pluck. Just as our hero had anticipated, some of the chambers lay open, their barred doorways beat and sprung, and their stone walls reduced to rubble. It took Purcell not many minutes to add substantially to the net worth of his estate. This is the business the church should have been about all along, he thought, sharing its gold with the poor instead of its condolences. Heavier by a good 20 pounds, he nevertheless executed a graceful pirouette and prepared to make his exit. But his choreographer had altered the pattern. Looking over his right shoulder, for no sound reason, he noticed that the one catacomb chamber that had been permanently sealed now gaped at its seams. The earthquake had squeezed its foreboding face until it smiled like a manic encyclopedia salesman. In imitation not of Nijinsky but of Ben-Hur the flea, Purcell hopped directly into the smile. One last probe in the orifices of the church, as it were. And, of course, that is how he met the corpse, with bounds that are not within everyone's power, particularly if their pockets are packed with gold. Plucky, pushed by curiosity or intuition or, quote, peculiar travel suggestions, end quote, bounded right into the mysterious compartment. And though the billowing dust observed the mummified bodies of the Messiah, it rested atop a jewel-encrusted sarcophagus wrapped about with dry, rotted linens, as if the Messiah were an immense, overcooked weenie in a tattered bun, just lying there, touched by nothing but time, and gently by it, as if the Messiah had been calmly awaiting Plucky Purcell for these 2,000 years. The question the critical reader must raise at this juncture is, how did Purcell recognize the mummy as Jesus? It is not an easy question. I myself, being a skeptical man of science, did not hesitate in scraping off a sample of wood fragments and dirt that clung to the corpse beneath its more recent coating of plaster, and airmailing it to the radiocarbon laboratory at Johns Hopkins for dating. My friend at the lab found the specimen unsuitable for really exact carbon-14 dating, but was able to approximate its age from 1,500 to 3,000 years. Probably that finding helped support my conviction of the body's identity, but to tell the truth, I was convinced without it. In fact, from the moment I focused vision upon the corpse, I knew that it was who it was. Plucky must have known instantly, too. It looked, to be sure, nothing like the milky portraits we had been shown in Sunday school. Looked hardly at all like the handsome gentleman with the Aryan profile and the 500-watt glow who effulged at us from calendars in Protestant parlors all over Dixie. It was short, as swarthy and oily as a Greek olive, and its face was overshadowed by a nose that arched and hooked like the beak of an enlarged buzzard. Yet it was inexplicably familiar. Although dead and withered, the corpse was animated by the absolute. When one stared at it, one's pupils jangled like alarm clocks that had been set long ago to go off at this moment. Logic was not necessarily suspended, nor common sense ignored. This simply, positively was not the body of an ordinary man. In its befouled stupor, it incited awe and marvel. Those of us who spent time with it experienced at least some of the tremendous power it must have held when it walked Galilee. Doubt collapsed in a racket of revelation, and we, most of us, paid homage to the pitiful Hebrew mummy as if it were a living saint. The chamber in which the Christ was hidden was small and dirty and apparently had not been opened in several centuries. However, the gems embedded in the tomb and the golden candelabra that bristled in the corners suggested that it had once been a shrine of highest, if secret, rank. Perhaps medieval popes had awakened after midnight to traipse in purple splendor down to that deepest catacomb, where they conducted clandestine masses for none but the most privileged princes of the church. Then, 1 year long ago, it had been decided that the secret was just too hot and the risk too great, so the Holy Office sealed off the remains of its precious figurehead, sealed them off even from itself. Maybe one curious prelate or another had looked in on them, had paid respects, but it seems doubtful if even a pope had peeked at the illustrious body in recent times. Of course, they knew it was there. Or did they? And if they knew, who knew? Those are telling questions which we deal with a little later. For the moment, let us appreciate the discovery. Purcell had danced upon the Lamb of God, dead and helpless, in Vatican concealment, and he had realized, furthermore, who it was whom he had found. And as stunned as he may have been, and as temporarily ignorant of the full apocalyptic implications of stealing the body as he may have been, he did not tarry, faint or fret, but immediately scooped up the mummy tenderly in his arms and prepared to bear it into man's modern world. No sooner did Plucky spring from the tomb than he became aware of an influx into the catacombs. Up until then, the voices and footsteps had all been moving in the other direction, as the bleeding and confused and the scared made their way to ground level. Now, in the quake's buzzing aftermath, investigating squads and files of guards were cautiously exploring the tunnels. They were still well above Purcell, but there was no way he might avoid meeting them on his ascent. What's this? A person coming? Damn the luck. He hadn't gotten 20 feet with his prize before somebody had spotted him. It was like being tackled at the line of scrimmage, a frustrating failure any time, but especially when Jesus is one's football. The figure, however, approached without seeing. Well, what do you know? It was one of the blind nuns who stand watch over the forbidden library. The tremor had played havoc with her collection of scrolls and left her in a daze all the more confusing because she was sightless. "Forgive me, sister." Plucky administered to her the most painless knockout in his karate repertoire. Like a rag penguin, she folded at his feet. Have you ever tried to undress a nun when you were in a hurry? It was maddening. All the tiny black buttons, stubborn hooks. But he at last disrobed her and clothed the corpse in her habit. The nun he wrapped in the corpse's rotten linens and deposited upon the sarcophagus. There he left here, but in case it has crossed your mind to wonder, as some of the purest people have wandered before you, what the good sister wore beneath her habit, let me remind you that Plucky Purcell is a Southern gentleman, and while the air he exudes may, by some moral standards, be excessively sulphurous, he would never ever be guilty of embarrassing or insulting a lady. What, if anything, the knocked-out nun wore closest to her private parts is a secret Purcell is prepared to protect to his grave. Crashing like a moose calf into the cranberry bogs of its first winter, Plucky crashed through catacomb earthquake debris, his natural running grace blunted by the corpse in his arms and the heavy gold doodads in the inner pockets of his robe. He made it the first staircase with no opposition, save his excess baggage and the rubble underfoot, but at the head of the stairs, on the second level, he ran into a party of soldiers. If I have given the impression that the Vatican was a bit casual in its concern for the treasures in its catacombs, you must keep in mind that while the combined contents of those few rooms of gold and silver and gems and art might be worth, say, $100 million, it is but a bubble in the church's bucket of wealth. The Vatican owns stocks and bonds valued at about $7 billion. It is the largest single stockholder in the world. The Vatican also owns property, secular as well as churchly, valued at many billions. It is the largest single real estate owner in the world. The baubles hidden in the catacombs are artifacts left over from an age when such hardware was the trappings of power. In these times they are clumsily anachronistic, almost embarrassing. Sooner or later they will be converted into more efficient tender. Meanwhile, however, they may be slighted, but they have not been forgotten. As soon as the quake had subsided, the Pope or one of his senior aides ordered the Swiss guard into the catacombs to secure the valuables and restore order. The Swiss guard filed into the dusty depths, armed not with quaint halberds, but with the latest automatic weapons supplied free by the Catholic munitions makers of America and Germany. Thus armed, it met Purcell as he lurched up the stone staircase from his rendezvous with Christ. Plucky was breathing hard. His breath rolled through the squad of soldiers like the waves of a second quake. The ocean of his breathing collapsed around the shadowy soldiers the way the ocean of fame collapsed around the gums of Judy Garland. "I've got a sister here," gasped Purcell, trusting that the well-educated captain of the guards understood English. "Must get her to a doctor." "Let me see her," ordered the haughty officer, his English as perfect as a snowflake. "Perhaps she needs first aid." "No, no," stammered Plucky. "She isn't seriously hurt. I think she's just fainted. Got to get her up in the fresh air." The captain recognized upon Purcell the black robe of Felicitate. Uninformed as he was about the exact nature of the society of the Felicitator, he knew that it occupied a special place of favor with the Holy Father, perhaps a more special place than his own command. He hesitated, as it is written in Poor Richard's, "He who hesitates will never stop Plucky Purcell." Our hero danced around the soldiers and plunged toward the next stairwell as if it were the Georgia Tech goal line. He was not pursued. St. Peter's Square was a chaos of searchlights, police cars, fire engines, ambulance, utility rocks, church officials of high and low standing, and emergency personnel of all sorts. At that time, the rumor that His Holiness had suffered grave injury had not yet been denied officially, and the fate of their Pope concerned the policemen to the point where they were emotionally unable to bring any kind of order to the scene in the square. Nobody detained Purcell as he rushed through the milling throngs, though many were the great Indian clucks of pity as bystanders witnessed the limp, quote, "nun," end quote, in his arms. Plucky hurried to an ambulance parked at the edge of the square and pulled open its rear doors. "Spitale!" he shouted, having somehow, during his Roman stay, learned the Italian for hospital. "Devo trovare un dottore," explained the driver. "Il sono un dottore," Purcell lied. "Spitale, presto!" On the way to the hospital, the ambulance was frequently detained by traffic jams as thousands of Italians, their eyes wide for spiritual experience, poured into Vatican City from throughout Rome. When finally he screeched up to the emergency door of the hospital, the driver found his ambulance empty. "Mamma mia," the monk, "the poor sister." "Where?" The driver fell to his knees and crossed himself. After bailing out of the ambulance, Plucky had bailed out of his robe. He wore jeans and a sweatshirt beneath it. He wrapped the corpse in it so that the corpse no longer looked like a nun. Several pieces of gold fell out on the sidewalk. Plucky left them for the horse and hurried on. He made his way to the studio of George O. Supper, the American pop artist famed for his plaster of Paris sculptures of anonymous men. "Now, George O., buddy, what I've got here is an unusual request. I've had the good fortune to get my meat hooks on an Egyptian mummy, a king, I think it was, a great pharaoh, rather valuable. It's all perfectly legal, George O. It's legally mine." "Bullshit," said Supper, "excepting that I'm allowed to take it out of Italy. Now what I'm asking you to do is—" "I know what you're asking. Let me think about it for a few days." "George, tonight, remember when you came over to me with that little Long Island Deb? I didn't ask to think it over. She could have had triplets by the time I thought it over." Sighing, Supper helped Plucky carry the corpse into his plaster casting room. "Purcell, if this mummy is full of drugs—" "Word of honor, Giorgio. You can examine it if you wish." Okay, I'm sleepy. "I've got to ship this out on an early morning flight. I'll build a crate while you plaster. Do you have any of those shipping tags that say, quote, work of art, end quote?" Goaded by his old friend, Supper worked feverishly. Beginning at the feet, the corpse turned slowly into a ghostly bland everyman or non-man or anti-man, depending on one's frame of reference, a white blob of a figure so empty of humanity that the viewers of the figure would have thrust upon them the startling option to fill the vacancy, to draw in character, to color the blandness from the palette of their own experience. It would be a typical Supper poker-faced marshmallow monolith. Not so much a man as a hole in the air where a man had stood seconds before, being vaporized. Man disappearing, man reduced to a silent white shadow of his species. As Sumter built the latest testimony to the existential impermanence and insignificance of John Doe, he felt queerly moved. No living model had ever affected him that way. Some strange kind of peaceful power seemed to surge from the mummy. By the time he began to plaster the face, Sumter's hands were trembling. He felt himself in touch with what he imagined were the ancient forces of Egypt. Funny, he said with a little amusement. It looks Jewish. It is mid-morning. A few minutes ago, I took my coffee break. I am speaking figuratively, of course. There's not a drop of coffee in this place, and there never has been. As a matter of fact, we are also out of juice. On my coffee break, I had a hot dog and a glass of tap water. There are plenty of damn hot dogs, all right, and water too. Last night the rain started. Amanda, as pale as raindrops but in good spirits, joined me on my coffee break. She sipped her water from an Apache bowl. No hot dog. You know, her vegetarianism no longer annoys me. If she doesn't want her belly to be a graveyard for dead animals, I appreciate her view. Her belly is for the living, not the dead. But this weenie business I could never understand. I enjoy a good hot dog myself, but let's face it, it is not an elite cut of meat. They grind up hog hearts in weenies and cow muscles and chicken fat and diaphragms of sheep and the esophagi of goats. Of all the meats with which a vegetarian might be reluctantly associated, surely the sausage is among the least respectable. Yet Amanda had chosen John Paul as her husband, and John Paul had chosen the sausage as his trade. Strange bedfellows. It's not as strange as all that, said Amanda. She slipped her water from a clay bowl with mythological designs. The rain stormed against the former roadside zoo. I say, quote, former, end quote, because the place has been stripped of its serpents and its fleas, like trolls splashing swamp waters on a sightseeing bus. The hot dog is not so much a food as it is an institution. President Roosevelt fed hot dogs to the King and Queen of England when they visited here in 1939. Babe Ruth ate nothing but hot dogs and soda pop for 20 years. Hot dogs are found wherever Boy Scouts get together. It is hot dogs the Packers have in mind when they boast that they use everything but the squeal. It's not what hot dogs are made of, but what they symbolize. The hot dog is a pillar of democracy, the pride of the Yankees, the boneless eagle of free enterprise. Well, I couldn't refute that, come to think of it. It is typical of John Paul Ziller that he would choose to work his African magic through the medium of one of Amanda's most beloved institutions. Ziller has turned the weenie into a wand. It was most agreeable sitting with Amanda. In the mustard pot, I traced the legend of her beauty. Amanda smiled and touched my hand. Life lifted its heavy wheels. I forgot about the task at the typewriter upstairs. I forgot about the rain. But just then, 2 agents burst in, shielding their weapons from the wet. They gave us greedy, patriotic looks. Hey, they yelled. Fix us, a bunch of them, dogs. Ben Franklin, to the contrary, one cannot take a stitch in time. No, not even to save 9. If only it were possible to stitch time, to pull it up tight, to hold it back. You see, I have no reason to believe that today is my last at the typewriter. The agents are supremely confident that Ziller and friends will be apprehended at any hour. Suppose they are right. I do not know what that will mean in terms of my fate or Amanda's, but I strongly suspect that have I not concluded this report by tomorrow morning, it will be involuntarily curtailed. Doom rides my typewriter carriage like a fat lady on a rubber horse. I pine for time because had I more of it, I could more successfully metamorphose my vigil with the roadside zoo's quaint realities so that other men might appreciate as well as I the setting and circumstance across which Christ's body continued its silent journey. If I write no further of Amanda's attempts to train butterflies to unfold dinner napkins, 2 insects to a napkin, of course, or of the maps with which Ziller traced his origin back to the sun, I'm sure I shall be forgiven. On the other hand, there are facts of daily life at the zoo to which the reader is entitled. I should like, for example, to tell more of baby Thor. Forgive me, Thor, if you are grown, a schoolboy reading this document either on assignment or out of natural curiosity concerning the historic event to which you, a yard child of less than 4, were privy, much as little Anastasia was privy to the annihilation of Russian royalty. Forgive me, I have neglected you in my chronicles. You were a joy to us as always. Ah, the flash upon your eyes. Your eyes summed up for me my studies in science. Your eyes reminded me of experiments in wave physics, of exercises in galactic mechanisms. Your eyes reminded me of a dozen different chemical reactions, particularly those which, if not carefully controlled, threatened to blow up the laboratory. Thor, your stepfather had, perhaps I should use the present tense, for Ziller has extraordinary resources, and he may well have survived his present pickle, a special feeling for light. He felt that since energy was the only permanent, quote, thing, end quote, in the universe, it was the most, if not only significant, quote, thing, end quote. And although he had great respect for sound, he believed that the highest form of energy is light. He seldom used color in his art because he had a theory that color was a disease that afflicted light, a parasite that lived off light and destroyed its purity. He was disturbed by the fact that 400 trillion waves of deep red light enter the human eye every second. What happens to light after it has been absorbed by the eye is a question that has intrigued many scientists. Ziller's attitude was, to hell with what happens to the light, what happens to the color. In an effort to control, quote, color pollution, end quote, he had trained his pupils to remain stationary for long periods of time. Ziller spoke of light as if it were applicable to living tissue, and since ultimately living tissue is a product of solar radiation, he was not entirely mistaken. But John Paul, I cautioned him once, the temperature of living tissue is much too low to produce the kind of energy that is necessary for radiation. We speak metaphorically of girls having glowing complexions, but flesh is never an actual source of light. And Amanda said, how about fireflies? Your mommy certainly knew her bugs. Well, I blushed. That's true. Fireflies make light, and some worms glimmer, and some toadstools. But living tissue is never energetic enough to stand a chance of combining with the activation energies such as sunlight. Then Thor, your stepfather, gently interrupted the game you were playing with Mon Kol, baboon, and you led up to me so that I could look into your eyes. Thor, I can't forget your eyes, but neither can I forget your happy heart. I did not know the identity of your true father. Your mother is more stingy with her gossip than with her love, but in your almost omnipotent cheerfulness, you were every giggle Amanda's child. Had I time, I would also like to write more of the people who stopped in at the zoo. Gunnar Hansen was typical of his surprisingly sophisticated farmers and fishermen who live in Washington's Skagit Valley. The broad-mindedness and general awareness of the sweet-tempered Skagit folk have made the area a refuge for artists from the generally more provincial metropolis of Seattle. Laconar, a picturesque wooden village built out over the Swinomish Slough, has been an important art colony for 40 years. Paintings and poems have sprung from the Misty Valley in an abundance nearly equal to the salmon, strawberries, and peas. It was not until Boeing aircraft built, in the mid-60s, a factory on the valley's edge that prejudice and reaction was smuggled into Skagit country, a part of the baggage of technicians and engineers. On these occasions, when the sheriff's office or the state patrol were called to investigate the goings-on at that, quote, weirdo hot dog zoo, end quote, invariably it was a newcomer to the valley, with some clear-eyed, tight-lipped little wing tank designer who was behind the call. Farmer Hansen, although he was mystified by certain elements of the zoo's character, as in truth was I, always approached the giant weenie with robust respect. You, Farmer Hansen, and your peers who fish these jaded waters, who till this Chinese brushstroke landscape and make it sprout with vegetables and flowers, I salute you. I do not know to what extent your lives are full, or how passionately enlightenment has touched you, but in your rare rural tolerance for eccentric people and new ideas, you have singed the damp air with your honor. Among the other regulars at the zoo was Salvatore Gladstone Tex, the cowboy who eventually became so familiar we were obliged to learn his name. I recall a mild evening in July. The sky was bent double by a heavy bar of moon-soaked clouds. The cowboy, Salvatore Gladstone Tex, knocked at the roadside zoo. He knocked as if shaking a tambourine. His horse, Jewish Mother, was left to graze in the parking lot. Slim pickings. "Howdy, ma'am," the cowboy said to Amanda. "I notice that you haven't added no more attractions to your zoo." "That's correct," said Amanda. "We're standing pat." "Well," said the cowboy, "I thought you might be of persuasion to buy this here watermelon." He held the melon in his arms as if it were an infant. "Oh," said Amanda, "I'll bet it's one you grew yourself." "I grow lots of watermelons, ma'am." "This one's different. It talks." Amanda listened politely. She overheard the melon say something like, "According to Plan Q." The watermelon had a high, squeaky voice. "I was just meandering through the melon patch when I heard it carrying on. There were 3 or 4 melons right snug together, and I had to listen real close to find out which one was doing the talking. It's this one, all right, to tell the truth." His voice assumed a confidential tone. "I think it's the space people. They're trying to contact us through watermelons." Amanda listened again. The watermelon said something like, "Driver, a sizable reward for you if you reach the station in time for the express." High, squeaky. Said Amanda. Was the cowboy throwing his voice? She gave him, Mr. Tex, a $2 deposit and told him that if she was satisfied, she would pay the rest on Saturday. She thumped the watermelon. At least it was ripe. While Amanda was upstairs giving Thor his bath, John Paul came home from the woods. He had been drumming, jungle style. He was tired and in need of refreshment. He sat at the kitchen table and devoured the melon. Amanda couldn't hear him with the water running. And that was the end of that, except the next morning, at his bowel movement, John Paul swore the first turd said, "Hello." Were I trying to compose the great American novel instead of factually documenting a particular event, I would draw my characters not from the Zillers, as worthy as they may be and as much as I've come to care for them, nor from the likes of Salvatore Gladstone Tex, nor even from the young lion-haired itinerants who, by the scores, called the Captain Kendrick Memorial Hot Dog Wildlife Preserve as if they were a stopping-off place on a vast socio-religious pilgrimage. No, my subjects would be selected from among the tourists and vacationers, the ordinary clerks and machinists and salesmen, their wives and kids. For just as the zoo could not have thrived without their patronage, the nation itself is wedded to their aggressive mediocrity. They are in the stuff of America as the corn is in the pudding. And it is upon their reaction to the discovery of Christ's body that the future of Western civilization may well rest. Whether the revelation of the corpse will expedite an evolved golden era free of religious superstition, false hopes, and crippling guilts, or whether it will plunge humanity into a horrible dark age of helplessness and despair is entirely up to them. Already they sense, as in a more articulate and less fearful manner do the young itinerants, that something is amiss in mankind's motor, that enormous changes are swelling on every horizon, and they are skittish. Just observing them at the zoo, munching frankfurters and gathering amusement from the pretty painted fleas tilting their chariots on the sharp turns of the track, I accumulated fair insights into the national mood, and where some perceptive writer to follow them back to their beauty shops in Salt Lake City, their barbecue furnaces in Moline, their TV dens in Riverside, Massillon, and Fargo, they might be looked through as living microscopes, magnifying in ignorance both the dangerous germs and precious bacteria that advance upon the organs of our race. But that is not my assignment. I simply haven't time for that. Surely the reader can understand my hurry. Outside my door are armed agents who delight in reminding me that prison, or worse, awaits me as soon as the magician and the athlete are nabbed with their precious booty in whatever Florida cypress grove they cringe. That, however, is not the only reason why I escalate the drafting of my report. These past few days of constant sitting at the Remington have succeeded in aggravating old rectal troubles. It is said that Napoleon suffered most of his life from similar afflictions, and in fact must have lost his battle with Wellington due to an acute attack of hemorrhoids. If hemorrhoids could cost Napoleon his Waterloo, what toll might they take on your diligent correspondent? Amanda's butterfly songs do not altogether cheer me as I sit in the smoking wreckage of my second largest, if not second loveliest, orifice. Jesus crossed the Atlantic on Transworld Airlines flight number 115. Despite rumors of his ascension, it was probably the longest trip he ever took. I wrote, quote, probably, unquote, because there are parties who would have us believe that Jesus got around. Pardon me, but I reject out of hand the notion that the Messiah spent his, quote, missing years, end quote, on another planet. I believe that the flying saucer was Jesus' customary mode of transportation, no more than I believe that Mon Cull knows an English word that rhymes with orange. There is no limit to the nonsense some people expect you to swallow. I have heard that Jesus went into India for his missing years. Not likely. Just because by Hindu and Buddhist standard his, quote, radical, unquote, teachings were old hat does not prove he went to India to formulate them. Jesus read a lot. His favorite subject, next to Jewish cultures, he would have been attracted but not sympathetic to Portnoy's complaint, was philosophy. Moreover, his hometown was just off the great road that connected the Roman world with the Far East, and the caravans were often camped beneath Nazareth Hill. An inquisitive young man could pick up a lot of philosophy around a caravan campfire. On the other hand, there is no reason why, at least once, he could not have gone up to the great road to India himself. If you were Jesus and had missing years to kill, where would you go? Nearly Normal Jimmy is of the opinion that Jesus took his missing years and went to Tibet. Without blinking a lash, Nearly Normal Jimmy will tell you that Jesus spent the prime years of his life on a lamasery prayer rug, charging his spiritual batteries for the work ahead. Nearly Normal Jimmy believes all things enlightened originated in Tibet. Adolf Hitler was of the same persuasion. I'm not kidding, it's a fact. Hitler had a mystical streak as wide as the Rhine. Hitler believed the Aryans a super race, and his anthropologists traced the roots of Aryan stock to Tibet. Hitler went all out for Tibetan friendship. In 1939, there were more high lamas in Berlin than any place in the world outside of Lhasa. Nearly Normal Adolf. Anyway, you look at it. Jesus was covering a new territory, Rome to Seattle, inside a plaster cast, inside a wooden crate, inside a freight belly of TWA Flight 115. The Atlantic Ocean lay beneath him like a frozen sky, and then the land. At the exact moment that his plane crossed over Newfoundland, an elderly St. John's lady, known for her visions of the Virgin, had an epileptic fit. George O'Supper, taking Jesus to the air freight terminal, almost had a fit himself. His anxiety was unwarranted, however. He had shipped to New York or London at least a dozen of his plaster figures, and then customs officials were used to them by now. Accustomed to them, I might say, if I were of a mind to pun. At 5 a.m., after a night of tremors, the customs men welcomed something to joke about. They deserved their laughs. They were men of the Italian tradition. Their culture had produced Michelangelo, Giotto, Leonardo, Botticelli, Raphael, and Titian, to name but a few old masters. Who could blame them for poking fun at those crude plaster ghosts the Yankee supper insured so heavily and labeled, quote, works of art, end quote? The customs men were laughing so hard, they failed to notice that on the Yankees' latest pale, lumpy, and baseless sculpture, the plaster was not yet dry, nor did they pay particular attention to the fact that this Last Supper, gulp, was addressed not to a museum or a gallery, but to a, quote, memorial hot dog wildlife preserve. Crazy Americans, anyway. Plucky Purcell boarded the jetliner and sat down by the only unescorted female passenger on the flight. Her beauty was moderate, but Plucky needed her voice, her sense, to ease his nerves. He had been up all night, building the shipping crate, locating a fence to buy his gold. In the pizza-colored dawn, the implications of his body snatch were coming home to him. A shudder slid down his athletic backbone like a moon-mad snake down an alcoholic's watch chain. He turned to the young woman passenger. He gave her his cement mixer grin. The plane cleared the field, and she fell immediately to sleep. For the time being, Purcell wasn't terribly worried. He had analyzed the situation and drawn temporary comfort from his reasoning. A tender, quote, good morning, and quote, from his fellow passenger would have helped, but he would get along without it. Only a few very powerful officials in the church would know of the existence of the corpse, he reasoned. It had been a night of chaos. Possibly they did not know as yet that the most dangerous of skeletons had been liberated from Rome's closet. Even if they discovered the theft, they would be limited as to steps they might take for recovery. Obviously, they would not be able to spread a general alarm. They would be afraid to alert the Italian police. Oh, if he, the mad Pluck, were under suspicion, they might ask the help of secular authorities in tracking him down. But in the confusion of the moment, they would not have settled on a suspect. Sooner or later, he would be their target, and their agents would sniff for his trail, no question of that. But that was a day or two away. Meanwhile, he would have made it to the roadside zoo, he and his cargo, and then Plucky lit a cigar. The stewardess ordered him to extinguish it. He snarled at her. A woman is not always a woman, but a good cigar is a horse of a different feather, he growled. Somewhere over the sea, over a pot of whales, or a school of anchovy, or some flotsam, or some other confetti of the sea, the girl beside him awakened. Purcell could tell she had been dreaming, much as he and the Pope had been dreaming only 9 hours earlier. I just had a geographical dream, the girl said in a voice nearly as soundless as the jet. When he pressed her for details, before she turned to the window, she said, "It was a geographical dream. You know, one to file with your National Geographics." That was the week for coming out of dreams, trailing clouds of glory. There is a time in the life of every little girl when she wants to grow up to be a nurse. There may be a time, too, when she wants to be a movie star or a cowgirl, but those fantasies quickly pass, while the nurse fantasy may linger with intermittent cowgirl and movie star flashes. From kindergarten through the first years of high school, she will nurse her dolls for broken limbs or sawdust hemorrhages, scolding them when they fall out of bed or do not eat their mud puddle soup. She will daydream of caring for real little babies and of giving aid and comfort to whole hospitals full of nice men like her daddy. The archetypal mother goddess, the ancient image of woman as nature's healer and restorer, stirs early in the breast of the female child. The experience of playing doctor with the little boys in the neighborhood in no way diminishes her ambition. Oh, the pre-pubic thrill of the backyard enema. Amanda, an exception to the rule, never aspired to be a nurse. She mended the wings of dragonflies and in other ways fulfilled her duties as a guardian of the life process. But there was a minimum of charm for her in the notion of wearing starched uniforms and performing mundane chores under orders from ill-tempered spinsters. Amanda did not want to be a movie star or a cowgirl either. "What are you going to be when you get big?" her father asked. Amanda, in an orange sunsuit, had tired of chasing moths and was studying the peculiar afternoon shadow projected across the countryside by Bow Wow Mountain. "There is no name for what I'm going to be when I get big," she answered. On the Rand McNally Atlas map of the world, the United States of America is colored pale lime. I assume it was an arbitrary choice of color, not symbolic, and certainly not realistic. As anyone who has flown cross-country well knows, the USA is greenish-brown. There may be patches of gray, yellow, and blue, some solid chartreuses, and some solid chocolates, but generally America, from the altitude of an airliner, is a light brown flecked, smeared, or mottled with various shades of dull green. The color scheme is maintained from East Coast to West Coast, an admirable if monotonous consistency. One of the few places where the scheme is altered, where it really breaks down and becomes a color experience of a different order, is in the area of northwestern Washington. After hours of flight above lackluster greenish-brown, a Seattle-bound plane will eventually cross the Cascade Mountain Range and suddenly find itself gliding over the open throat of an emerald. The scene below is moist and brilliant, a light, bright, pervasive green, at once so misty and so vivid that one suffers the illusion that one has come at last to the only region of our nation that is truly green, the place where green turns Zen cartwheels into celebration of the death of brown. Jesus spent most of his days in brown. Jesus walked on stony places and thin soil. Jesus climbed gaunt hills and naked mounds. Jesus slept in austere deserts and in towns made entirely of clay. Jesus was the child of the Scorpion Lands, a poet of the dun flanks of Galilee. The meaty sun had backed down into his eyes so thoroughly that not even the lush plain of Gennesaret could relieve his thirsty vision. Now, thanks to plucky Purcell, Jesus of the ultimate thorny brown was landing amidst the ultimate melting green. It is unfortunate that Jesus was not aware of his new surroundings. It would be interesting to observe what effects such a nebulous green landscape would have upon the teachings of such a stark brown philosopher. As far as Purcell could determine, there were no Catholic agents waiting at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. He rode the limousine to the Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle, took a taxi to a service station that rented U-Drive trucks, leased a van, drove back to the airport, stopping for a Big Mac burger and a root beer, picked up the destined crate, and headed north on Interstate 5. It was about 4 p.m. when his tired eyes caught sight of the giant weenie. "There's the giant weenie," he said aloud. There was no response from the crate. Having come finally to the Zillers' fabled roadhouse, Plucky threw himself through the door with an abandon that would have broken the joints of the gods. He traded his exhaustion and anxiety for a bouquet of surprise. The message sent on the wind, as the Tibetans called telepathy, had failed to advise Amanda of Purcell's visit, although since moving to the roadhouse she had known that momentous meetings were to transpire there. There was hugging and laughter and poetic exchanges and passing of the hashish pipe. Baby Thor climbed aboard Plucky's broad shoulders, and Mon Cole, bitten by the festive mood, executed a series of the most amazing somersaults. A toasty joy set the zoo aglow as the old friends savored the reunion. But then there came the business of the corpse. They opened the crate in the pantry. As John Paul, using his sculptor's tools, peeled the plaster from the mummy, Plucky paced. Ziller had never seen him nervous. Tremulous knees seemed incongruous on such healthy specimen of manhood. Purcell, however, could recall other moments of knee flutter. First game on the Duke varsity. Opening kickoff. The ball seemed to float for hours in the tobacco-yellow Carolina September, hovering against the Indian summer blue sky like a sausage which gland trouble hovering over a meadow of hungry hobbits. Lolling toward his end of the field with no more movement than a sailboat in a doofy watercolor, tumbling finally toward his waiting embrace like a suicidal actress falling in slow motion at the climax of a French film, end over end, in lazy lyrical descent, while every eye in the bourbon-bathed stadium focused upon the much-heralded sophomore sensation. And 11 angry men, none smaller than himself, thundered toward him at 100 times the speed of the buoyant football. A muted whump as the pigskin settled in his arms, squeezed it harder than he had ever squeezed any hot pants cheerleader in his daddy's old Pontiac. A leap down the field, 5 yards, 15. Then the nauseating crush. The breath flew out of him as wildly as if a buffalo in a rocking chair had suddenly rocked back on his lungs. Hit the ground so hard beads of blood rolled out of both nostrils. The crowd moaned with him, and together they, Plunky and the thousands, felt the tension evaporate in the mellow air. You know who this is, don't you? Yes, said Amanda slowly, I think I do. John Paul's head bobbed slightly in a cautious jungle nod. Baby Thor and Mon Cole had fallen asleep. The last Beatles record had finished playing 20 minutes earlier, and the phonograph had shut itself off. In silence, the three of them stood in the pantry and stared at the withered body. Well, what are we going to do with him? Ziller would say nothing. From his loincloth he pulled a small bamboo flute. He sat at the Messiah's feet and played very softly. The notes could not be heard outside the room. Plucky turned to Amanda. What are we going to do with him? He repeated. Amanda swabbed plaster dust from Jesus' forehead with a sponge. Her gaze was drenched with tenderness. I think he deserves a decent burial, she said. There are several ways of looking at an FBI agent. One of these ways is over at Tsetse Fly. Our Tsetse Fly was moored in a cube of amber, its thin wings frozen in a single-minded elegance, its hairy legs straddling eternity. Not a bad way to be preserved, I thought, and then, still looking at the agent over the Tsetse Fly, I recalled the shabby remains of our Lord. A couple of days after Jesus arrived at the zoo, Amanda gave him a bath in a tub of Mr. Bubble and anointed him with oil of the prune. That helped a lot. When John Paul ran away with the mummy, moreover, he dressed it in Plucky Purcell's $250 pinstripe, velvet-collared rock and roll suit, hacking inches off pant legs and coat sleeves with his hunting knife to get a fit. No matter how moldily he may for centuries have lain, the Messiah has gone to the apocalypse in style. From my perspective, the FBI agent's head rose above the coffin of the Tsetse Fly like a North Atlantic moon rising above a barge of lemon jello. It was a cold moon whose light made lovers shiver and change their minds. The agent, as I saw him over the Tsetse Fly, was swinging his customary iron. He swung with bland concentration. If the agent had wanted to smile at his imaginary golf ball, neither Amanda nor I would have stopped him, but he swung with bland concentration. Perhaps he could not bridge the gap between the real club and the illusionary ball. Perhaps if he were on the links with the surf beneath his feet and a buddy to share his sport and no roadside distractions in his life, he would have gathered some mirth in his swing. He was, after all, a man still in his prime. Not without dignity, not without a cleft chin, for which many aspiring young actor would have paid dearly at the cleft chin makers to the stars. The agent, as I saw him over the Tsetse Fly, looked as if he were someone's father. No doubt he was. The tone of his voice, in fact, was fatherly as he, contrary to orders, began to converse with Amanda in the kitchen. I can't understand you young people. I just can't understand you. I guess you've just had it too easy. We've spoiled you till you're soft and rotten. How do you mean? Asked Amanda. She was boiling wheat custard for Thor's lunch. The way you show no responsibility. Responsibility to what? Inquired Amanda. Why, to our democratic way of life, to our tax-supported institutions, to individual human animals, Amanda ventured. Ours is a government of laws, not of men, the agent proclaimed. Maybe that's the problem. What do you mean problem? You don't know what you're talking about. Our laws are sacred. Aren't our people sacred? Until a law is removed legally from the statute books, it must be obeyed blindly by everybody if we want to continue to live in a democratic society and not slide back into anarchy. We've got to have laws and retribution. Ever since we crawled out of caves, retribution has followed wrongdoing as the day. When retribution ceases to follow evil, then the fabric of civilization begins to unravel. Amanda stirred the custard. If we've always had retribution, how do you know what happens when we don't have it? She asked. The agent scoffed. You people in this weirdo place. He gestured toward the front room but did not see me behind the shrine of the tsetse fly, resting my hemorrhoids. You people, that fucking magician, I don't know all it is you've got yourselves into, but you wouldn't be in this mess with your government and with the church if somebody had raised you with a little guts, if somebody had put the fear of God in you. You're talking about the fear of authority. Authority? Damn right. You never learn to respect authority. In order to be respected, authority has got to be respectable. Amanda whipped the custard with a wooden spoon. Oh, our duly constituted authority isn't respectable enough for you? The only authority I respect is the one that causes butterflies to fly south in fall and north in springtime. You mean God? Not necessarily. You can't possibly question authority, said the agent, ignoring the implications of her last remark. Who are you to question it? You don't remember the war against fascist aggression back in the 40s. When America defended herself against Hitler, you weren't even born. Young lady, I risk my life in order that you could have freedom and education and all the good things of our society. The authorities of this nation saved it as a free and decent place for you to live in. But you don't remember that, do you? I risked my life. You risked your life, but what else have you ever risked? Have you ever risked disapproval? Have you ever risked economic security? Have you ever risked belief? I see nothing particularly courageous in risking one's lives. So you lose it. You go to your hero's heaven and everything is milk and honey till the end of time, right? You get your reward and suffer no earthly consequences. That's not courage. Real courage is risking something you have to keep on living with. Real courage is risking something that might force you to rethink your thoughts and suffer change and stretch consciousness. Real courage is risking one's cliches. The agent was thoughtful for a moment. Then he spewed, What the hell do you know? Who are you? One infantile weirdo girl to make those changes? What crap, what nerve. The United States of America is and always has been the greatest country on earth. The United States of America is less than 200 years old. There were great civilizations in India and China for 4,000 years. Tibet was in a state of advanced enlightenment 6,000 years ago. Amanda talked quietly. She loathed arguments. They were small-scale wars. Here, she said, have some of this warm custard. There's plenty for all of us. Amanda offered a Haida bowl brimming with custard. The custard steamed and soaked up milk. The custard did its work silently. It made a pleasing contrast to the cool northwest rain that drummed its countless fingers on the woods and fields outside. That bowl of custard was something you could depend on, something domestic and secure. It would not run off to sea with Jack London or follow a shaman into his hut. That custard was tractable and responsible enough to suit any authority. And its warm diplomacy could conceivably heal ruptures between opposing philosophies. But the mention of China had been too much for the agent. China, too much. Scorning the custard, he stalked out the back door, putting iron in hand, whirling around in the wet grove to yell, I'm an American and proud of it. Amanda gently closed the door behind him. I'm a human animal and prepared to accept the consequences, she said. There are several ways of looking at a lovely young woman tasting custard. One of these ways is over at Fly. It is approximately 11 a.m. now, but the rain is coming down like high noon. The rain is as gruff as a Chinese waiter. It keeps slamming silverware against the horizon. The sloughs look like spilled tea. Amanda, the gypsy ensemble as gay as the day is dour, is standing by my table talking about the incident with the agent downstairs. Actually, she was saying, he was rather fatherly. Yes, I believe he wants to like you, but the political gulf is too wide for him to cross. I don't know a thing about politics. That's all he knows. He's completely power-oriented. He's a symbol junkie? A what? A symbol junkie. People like him, that is the majority, are strung out on symbols. They're so addicted that they prefer abstract symbols to the concrete things which symbols represent. It's much easier to cope with the abstract than with the concrete. There is no direct personal involvement, and you can keep an abstract idea steady in your mind, whereas real things are usually in a state of flux and always changing. It's safer to play around with a man's wife than with his cliches. Her logic is so simple that I'm afraid to trust it. Yet I want to keep talking at all costs. Give me an example, I say, zeroing in on her nipples, which, like revolutionary raspberries, are storming the walls of her shawl. Laws are the most obvious example. Laws are abstractions. Laws symbolize ethical arts, proper behavior toward other animals. Laws have no moral content. They merely symbolize conduct that does. These symbol junkies are always yelling about how we've got to respect the law. But you never hear one of them saying anything about respecting fellow beings. If we respected each other, if we respected animals, and if we respected the land, then we could dispense with laws and cut the middleman out of morality. Here in Washington State, the government has a slogan. You may have noticed it. Drive legally. If this were a concrete, realistic, as opposed to a civilized society, the bumper stickers would not say drive legally, but drive lovingly. What can we do about the symbol addicts? Do about them? Marx, you do react to things in a peculiar way. Why, for goodness sake, should we do anything about them? I protest, but it is too late. She is leaving the room, going to her sanctuary with its sense of bow-wow scenery, going to try another trance perhaps, and as she disappears behind the perfume curtains, I hear her say once more, I don't know a thing about politics. For once, Amanda did not get her way. Had Plucky and John Paul consented, the lot of them would have left the next morning for the Southwest and lain Jesus to rest on Bow Wow Mountain. I thought about that little knoll overlooking the place where the Skagit North Fork enters the Sound. You know, the one with the patch of Amanita muscaria and the bossy rock that looks like Walt Whitman's imagination. But that isn't right. Too much rain, too much chlorophyll. He wouldn't be comfortable there. If we can't take him back to Nazareth, then Bow Wow is the spot for him. He'd feel at home on Bow Wow Mountain. Sometimes one got the idea that Amanda thought Bow Wow Mountain was the center of the universe, but she didn't have her way. A rapid burial was not quite what Purcell had in mind for his treasure. And Ziller offered no opinion. He just kept blowing his flute. Amanda and Plucky tried to talk it out, but Plucky was barely coherent and his voice took a turn toward the shrill. He clearly was experiencing nervous exhaustion. His sudden escape from the church after a year of cloistered karate, the aftershock of his apocalyptic theft, the harried sleepless night, these were taking their toll. It was touching to see so robust a man on the verge of hysteria. You better get some rest, Amanda said. Rest? Hell, I can't rest. It wasn't like the Mad Pluck. He had snoozed in a station house swarming with hostile cops following the police riots in Chicago. Now, perched on an alchemist stool, he lay his head against Amanda's shoulder. What kind of mess have I gotten us into, he moaned. Amanda slipped her hand into the front of Purcell's jeans. Her arm, bracelets and all, slid down inside his shorts. Her fingers closed with exquisite gentleness around the twin pods of his testicles. She lifted them lightly and let them nest, like the eggs of a rare songbird, in the spoon of her palm. The bird stirred on its nest. The weight upon her hand gradually increased. Her fingers worked their way out to the blunt end of a corona that was ballooning and throbbing like an inflatable tomato. "Well," said Amanda, "at least part of you is unbowed by Christian travails." Plucky grinned sheepishly. His big aristocratic face, which minutes before could have been mistaken for Hamlet's mirror, cracked with a lopsided pool hall leer. "John Paul," Amanda said, throttling the tomato. "I'm going to take Plucky up and rock him to sleep." Ziller nodded. He motioned with his eyes that they should use Marks Marvelous's apartment above the garage. As for himself, he continued to sit at the feet of the Christ, fluting single notes into the confines of the pantry as if he were feeding the fish in a pond. Amanda and Plucky left by the kitchen door. When more than 12 hours later, I, in innocence, returned from vacation, she was still rocking him to sleep in my bed. If the sound I overheard was a lullaby, it was news to Brahms. The next chapter begins with the image of a Greyhound bus streaking through a rural valley in the American West. That image is, in my humble estimation, an excellent one with which to begin a chapter, unless one is writing an epic of the Civil War, and I am gratified to have an opportunity to use it. Amanda came in just now to borrow a match for the lighting of incense and candles. I told her about the image with which this chapter begins. "Good," she said. "I think that's an excellent beginning image," I said. "It's fine," agreed Amanda. "You sure you haven't seen the wooden matches?" "It's just about as good a beginning image as anyone could come up with," I said. I was feeling cocky about my bus and my valley. Amanda stopped searching for the matches and looked me over. "Yes, Marks," she said, "one could begin a chapter with an image of feats performed by fairies, or an image of immunity from certain disasters, or an image of Moonstone and its properties, or an image of Don Ambrosio's pact with the devil, or an image of Chinese court dogs in moments of leisure, or an image of the origins of rigidity, or an image of an owl flying in an open window and perching on Picasso's easel, or an image of the unexplained appearance of gypsies in Europe in the 15th century, or an image of what J.H. Faber in The Life of the Caterpillar called the Great Peacock Evening. But you have chosen to begin with a bus and a valley, and that is wonderful. Now where are the fucking matches, dear? I got my trance to attend to." The next chapter begins with the image of a Greyhound bus streaking through a rural valley in the American West. The bus is rolling toward Canada. It is the Seattle-Vancouver Express. Not many passengers on this bus are noticing the huge flocks of ducks that are flying over the bus, flying from the mountains, visible miles to the right of the bus, and flying toward the salt marshes and inlets miles to the left and just out of sight of the bus. Yet the passengers on this bus are interesting, if for no other reason than they, like all who travel by Greyhound, believe, for the duration of the trip at least, in their own immortality. Among the passengers on this bus, and for the moment believing strongly in his immortality, is a mild-mannered, though slightly disreputable-looking young man who is trying to con the driver into making an unscheduled stop. The driver had agreed earlier to let him off in Mount Vernon, which was not a scheduled stop either, but there is a Greyhound depot there, and they could get away with stopping for a second. But now the young man is saying, "That roadside attraction about a mile up the road, the one with the giant enormous weenie, that would be perfect." The driver at last consents. With an irritated stomp of the air brakes, he woozies to an unsteady halt in the parking lot of the zoo, and of course, it is I, alias Marks Marvelous, who jumps out. According to my calculations, the day was Thursday. Sure enough, the zoo was closed. I walked around back, barely squeezing my suitcase between the trees and the grotesque ends of the ever-changing horizontal totems that protrude from the corners of the building. "Oof," I said, squeezing through. For a second, I was face to face with a horrible gargoyle bulldog. A string of sausages dangled from the fierce trap of his jaws. In his eyes were purple-red stones that Ziller had brought back from Africa, or was it India? Carved drool dropped from the bulldog's lips and glistened on the flanks of the sausages. "This is where you live and work?" I asked myself incredulously. I went directly to my quarters above the garage. The door was unlocked, but I had turned the knob only halfway when from my bedroom I detected the unmistakable grunts of love. I withdrew my hand. The grunts turned into giggles and the giggles into groans. I said. I started down the stairs. Then I thought, that's my bedroom. I whirled back to the door, and again I grasped the knob. The groans had turned into slobbers. My grip collapsed and fell from the handle. I resumed my descent. On the way downstairs, my brain chug-a-lugged a quart of Tabasco and wiped its lips with a saw. In the kitchen, John Paul sat with Thor and Mun Kull, sharing an early lunch. Ziller had made cream of banana soup, and they, the three of them, were dunking their donuts in it and lapping it from clay bowls. Ziller and his stepson were dressed in loincloths. Mun Kull, in between laps and dunks, would climb on the table and twirl from the light fixture, much as the broads in Ringling Brothers Circus twirl from ropes while the band plays "I'm in Love with the Girl on the Moon." "This is the place where I work and live?" I inquired of myself once more. The boy and the baboon waved wildly when I entered, slamming the door behind me. John Paul arched his mustache in welcome. Well, I assumed it was welcome. He offered me soup, but was not surprised when I declined. He was aware of how red was my brain. "Relax," he said. "The mad pluck has returned from his Catholic odyssey and is even now enjoying the deserts of the prodigal." Purcell was here. That made me feel better, but not much. Finding no other spirits, I poured myself a tumbler of wine vinegar, cursing the Italian who brought the grape to such an ignoble end. I joined the rowdy trio at table and told Ziller a bit about my trip. In California, I had encountered an organization known as Frontiers of Science. Its members were scientists and interested laymen who had become concerned with the ultimate meaning of their lives and their work. For them, the line between the subject and the object was vanishing. Their creed was this statement by Heisenberg: "The scientist can no longer contemplate and investigate nature objectively, but submits it to human questioning and ever links it to the destiny of man." Heeding the advice of Einstein and Oppenheimer, they were beginning to put their vast knowledge to a more inspired use than weapon making and extraterrestrial one-upmanship. Their research in pure science had taken them beyond science into the realm of the personal, the poetic, the mystical, the occult. One of them explained in my presence why physicist Murray Gell-Mann calls his theory of mathematical symmetry among particles in space, quote, "the eightfold path," end quote. Another took me to a lecture on Western biology and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in which the speaker accounted how advanced biologists have found karma and its corollary of reincarnation genetically reasonable. John Paul can understand why I was attracted to Frontiers of Science. For the first time, I had found colleagues with interests somewhat similar to mine. I wrote, quote, "somewhat," end quote, because I still regarded 95% of mysticism as a crock of crap. At the same time, however, I was convinced that science had a critical role to play in the religion of the future. For the winter, Frontiers of Science had leased a rundown resort hotel in the hills above Stockton. Its members were sponsoring 3 months of seminars and research. I told John Paul that I was considering joining them there. I didn't tell him that I was also considering not joining them. It was difficult to admit, even to myself, how much I had missed Amanda on my holiday, and I was stubbornly, injustifiably, of the opinion that something of consequence might transpire at the roadside zoo. Something of consequence indeed. "You are back just in time," said Ziller. He gave me the oddest look I have ever seen on a man's face. Perhaps it was the look of a wry warlock who immediately prior to being burned at the stake has requested wool socks to keep his feet warm. Then he took me to the pantry, where he unfastened a brand new padlock and introduced me to Jesus.